The year was 1863, and the fields of Franklin Parish stretched wide under a sun that punished the living without mercy. Cotton plants bowed low as if beaten down by heat, their white blooms no softer for the hands that plucked them. Life at Westcott Plantation was not measured by hours or seasons, but by lashings, footsteps, and silence. That silence was heavy, always waiting, always watching, and it gave shape to the land as much as the fences or the rows of cane. People lived inside it, breathed it, carried it like a second skin. It was here that whispers first took root, whispers that spoke not of escape, but of something deeper, something that stirred beneath the soil itself. Overseer Josiah Brant thrived in that silence. He was not a man of wealth or birth, not a landowner with obligations or family honor to uphold. He came from the Appalachian backwoods, unclaimed and unbound, drawn south not by prosperity, but by dominion. By the age of 30, he had carved his place as a man feared not for authority, but for cruelty. He carried a whip unlike any other, braided with copper at the tip, its crack a piercing sound that cut through the quarters like a scream drawn into metal. Some said he soaked it in salt water between uses. Others whispered he had given it a name, though no one dared to ask him what that name was. He treated suffering not as punishment, but as entertainment. His games made men crawl in circles or kneel on shards of glass until their skin tore. He made boys dig shallow graves only to laugh when he ordered them filled in again. Plantation owner Reginald Westcott turned a blind eye. His health had waned, and his body sagged under years of indulgence and illness. Efficiency was all that mattered to him now, and Brant delivered results. Cotton weighed and steady, output never faltered, and so the old man looked away from the whispers about his overseer's pleasure and pain. Even in private, though, Westcott admitted that Brant had something wrong behind the eyes, a stillness too precise, a calm too deliberate. He never drank, never gambled, never chased women. He only observed, waited, and inflicted. Among the enslaved, endurance was a language without words. It was in the small songs hummed low in the fields, in glances exchanged when Brant's back was turned, in the way one hand might brush another's shoulder when lashes tore through flesh. Hope was thin, brittle as dry cane, but it lived. And when Elijah arrived one winter morning, that brittle hope began to harden into something sharper. He was a stranger, tall and broad-shouldered, with scars that marked his neck and palms, circular burns that seemed deliberate rather than accidental. No one knew from where he came, whether sold from another plantation or taken from freedom. But his presence was different. He worked with precision, every movement steady, his gaze unflinching. Unlike the others, he did not lower his eyes when Brant passed. Brant noticed. He tested the newcomer with small cruelties at first, withholding food, isolating him in a shed for nights on end. Elijah endured in silence. Then came the public lashings, copper-biting skin in front of watching eyes. Still Elijah did not bend. One afternoon, when the whip split his back and blood soaked the dirt, Elijah turned his head, met Brant's eyes, and whispered so quietly that only those nearest could hear. "The earth takes back what's been stolen." His voice was steady, almost calm, and yet it carried into the silence like a spark in dry grass. From that moment, the atmosphere shifted. The enslaved men and women began to move with a strange rhythm, a shared breath that linked them. 12 of them in particular drew closer to Elijah, not with words, but with looks, with gestures, with a cadence that did not belong to the overseer's clock. They began to carve small marks into bark, into stone, into scraps of cloth tucked beneath mattresses. Spirals, crosses, lines that twisted into shapes unfamiliar yet intentional. Patterns repeated, echoes of traditions carried across oceans, blended with scraps of Christian hymns and hidden prayers. Brant sensed change, but did not understand it. He felt eyes on him in the fields, saw glances exchanged when his back was turned. He began to hear things no one else noticed, a dog growling at shadows, birds falling silent when he entered the quarters, the wind itself dying down as he walked alone between rows of cane. At night, he swore he heard scratching at his door, faint and deliberate, though nothing was ever found in the morning. He tightened his grip on the whip, testing it in the dark, striking the air as though he could frighten shadows into obedience. The 12 never spoke of what they were doing. They hummed low songs no one recognized, passed stones from hand to hand, drew circles in the dirt only to smooth them over before dawn. The silence grew heavier, not the silence of fear, but the silence of preparation. The animals knew it, too. Dogs refused to enter the quarters. Horses balked near the shed. Even the frogs in the bayou grew still, their night songs cut short as though the earth itself had chosen to hold its breath. Brant mistook the stillness for submission. He thought the silence was his triumph, the final proof that he had broken every back, bent every will. But the silence did not belong to him. It was not fear he commanded now. It was patience. A rhythm older than his whip, older than the landowner's claim, older even than the cotton fields themselves. Something had begun to gather, something he could not see or name. And so the days wore on, marked by the same cruel routine, yet beneath it all, the soil remembered. Each step pressed deeper into a story that had not yet been spoken. Each lash struck against a silence that was no longer passive, but waiting. The overseer walked among men and women who no longer feared him, though he did not yet know it. What rose in their eyes was not rebellion in the open sense. It was something darker, quieter, a decision forged in silence and bound not by rage but by ritual. The whispers grew, though no one spoke. They lived in the fields, in the cabins, in the air itself, until even Brant could not ignore the weight of them. He carried his whip with more certainty each day, striking harder, forcing laughter from lips that no longer meant it. He thought himself master of silence. He had no idea the silence had already chosen his fate. The winter of 1863 deepened, and with it the strange quiet on the plantation thickened like fog that refused to lift. Josiah Brant kept his whip close, the copper tip glinting whenever lamplight struck it, and he carried himself with the stiff pride of a man who believed fear was eternal. Yet beneath the surface, something shifted. The enslaved still bent their backs, still sang under their breath, still obeyed his orders. But their eyes no longer broke away from his. They held steady, calm in a way that unsettled even him, though he would not admit it aloud. Brant had never been a man of imagination, yet he began to sense patterns he could not name. He noticed scraps of bark carved with spirals, stones etched with simple marks half buried in the soil. Once, he found a small bundle of twine wound so tightly it looked ready to snap. He crushed it in his fist and tossed it aside, never guessing that another just like it had been placed under his pillow while he slept. The fields seemed the same, but the silence that ruled them was no longer his doing. It belonged to the 12 who had gathered around Elijah, 12 who carried something in their hands more powerful than steel or copper, patience bound to memory. Each of the 12 came from a different corner of the quarters. A cook who had served meals laced with whispered prayers. A boy of barely 13 who could etch symbols in the dirt with one motion of his heel. A stable hand whose scars traced his arms like rivers and whose strength was known to all. They did not meet in open defiance. They passed glances, exchanged fragments of song, brushed shoulders as they carried buckets. Yet from those fragments a web formed, invisible yet unbreakable, binding them in a pact that needed no words. Elijah was not their leader in name, but their rhythm followed his steps. He worked with the same calm each day, steady as the turning of seasons. When Brant lashed him, he did not cry out. When food was withheld, he did not falter. He bore the cruelty with an expression that was not defeat but waiting. In his presence the others found a mirror, a way to imagine endurance as something sharper than submission. He spoke little, but when he did, the words lodged deep. "The earth takes back what's been stolen," he had whispered once. It became the heartbeat of their silence. Brant grew restless. His games brought him less pleasure. He would force men to kneel on gravel until their knees bled, yet they did not beg. He ordered women to choose between lashes or sleepless nights in the cold, yet they endured with an expression that mocked his control. The laughter he once wrung from himself came less easily, as if the silence of the 12 had wrapped itself around him too. He prowled the quarters at night, whip in hand, searching for someone to break. But each time he found nothing except the sound of his own boots striking dirt. Stranger things followed. The dogs stopped approaching the slave quarters, whining at the threshold. Horses pulled back from the fields near the cabins, their ears flat, their nostrils flared. Birds that once nested in cane stalks vanished. Even the frogs in the swamps grew quiet. The nights, once full of buzzing and chirping, fell into a hush so complete it pressed against the chest like weight. Brant told himself it was coincidence, yet he caught himself listening, straining to hear something beyond the silence. At times he thought he heard faint humming, a tune too low to place, and when he turned toward the sound, it was gone. The 12 did not waver. They carried out their duties by day and moved with careful purpose at night. They scratched symbols into wooden beams, then rubbed them smooth before dawn. They buried carved stones beneath hearths, left spirals drawn in ashes that disappeared with the first light. Each mark was placed with intention, each gesture stitched into a pattern that only they understood. It was not rebellion in the sense of blades or fire. It was slower, more deliberate, as if they were weaving a net around the overseer, thread by invisible thread. Brant's sleep grew broken. He woke to the feeling of breath at his ear, though no one stood near him. He dreamed of being buried in soil, unable to scream, his lungs filling with dirt. He told himself it was fatigue, nothing more. Still he woke drenched in sweat, his hand gripping the whip as though it were the only thing that kept him tethered to the waking world. Each day, as he walked through the fields, he felt the eyes of the 12 upon him. They were not defiant, not pleading. They were patient. That patience unnerved him more than any outburst of anger could. The quarters themselves began to feel different. When he entered, the air seemed thicker, as if he were stepping underwater. Shadows clung to corners even when lamps were lit. He lashed harder, demanded more output, yet the silence deepened. Once, in a fit of frustration, he struck a boy who had dropped a pail of water. The whip sang, the copper tip cutting across skin. But instead of cries, the boy looked up with eyes steady and unblinking. Behind him, others held the same gaze. Brant felt for the first time that he was not feared. He was simply being watched. The old man Westcott noticed none of this. His mind had retreated into sickness and self-preservation. He saw bales weighed, cotton gathered, profits intact, and thought nothing else mattered. Brant remained efficient, and efficiency meant silence. Yet what Westcott did not see was that the silence was no longer his overseer's weapon. It had turned into something else entirely, something that moved through the 12 like breath held in unison, waiting for the moment to be released. The overseer mistook the stillness for surrender. He could not see that he was already walking inside the circle they had drawn, invisible but absolute. Every step he took pressed him deeper into it, every lash tightened the net. The 12 did not need blades. They had time, patience, and the earth itself. Brant's fate had already begun to take shape, though he still believed himself master of the fields. In truth, he was already theirs, caught in silence too vast to escape. The moon rose swollen and red over the fields, casting a glow that made the cane shimmer like blades. The air hung heavy, wet with a storm that never came, thick enough to choke. It was the 12th night of silence, and though no word had passed between them, the 12 knew the time had come. They did not meet in one place, nor announce their gathering. They moved like water through the shadows, converging without command, as though their feet had been guided by something older than choice. Elijah stood among them, not above, his face calm, his eyes steady. No orders were given. None were needed. The rhythm of what had to be done had already been carved into their bones. Brant entered the quarters alone. No one ever learned why. Some whispered he had heard a noise, others that he sought a runaway who did not exist. Perhaps the silence had finally broken him, pulling him inward to the very place where it waited. He carried the whip as always, its copper tip gleaming faintly in the lamplight, his boots striking the floor with soldierly precision. He did not sense the 12 at first. They stood in shadows, their breath low, their hands ready. When he did, it was too late. The strike was swift, practiced. He was not killed. That was never the plan. His arms were bound with cords darkened in ox blood, his shirt torn and twisted into a gag, his eyes covered. He struggled, thrashing with sudden fury, but the silence around him was heavier than chains. Hands pressed him down, steady and deliberate, each movement efficient. He tried to shout, but the gag swallowed the sound. He tried to fight, but their patience had been forged in years of endurance. His strength was nothing against theirs. He was dragged across the dirt floor, his boots carving shallow furrows that stopped at the edge of the cavity. The pit had been dug in secret, each handful of earth carried away in silence, each night deepening it. 6 feet down, squared at the edges, lined with rough-hewn wood and ash. Stones marked with symbols ringed its base, talismans placed with blood drawn from each of the 12. At every corner lay a small object, a carved token, a twist of twine, a scrap of cloth etched with lines of soot. The air above it felt colder, as though the earth itself waited with an open mouth. Brant was lowered into the hollow. He thrashed, muffled cries forcing themselves past the gag, but the sound was already changing. What escaped him did not rise into the air, but seemed to sink, drawn downward into the soil. The 12 circled the pit. No words passed. They had written what needed to be said on a strip of parchment days before, each of them leaving a mark upon it. That paper had been set alight and its ashes scattered in the cavity before he was placed inside. The ritual did not require voices. It required silence, patience, and the will to see it through. The covering began with bare hands. Earth was scooped and pressed down, dark soil falling across his chest, his arms, his face. The overseer writhed, his muffled screams rising and then dropping low, sinking into a pitch that seemed less human with every layer of dirt. His boots kicked once, twice, then stilled. The soil grew heavy over him, the circle of stones closing around his body like teeth. The silence deepened, not the silence of absence, but of binding. Each of the 12 spat once into the earth as it covered him, sealing the act with breath and salt. By the time the last handful was pressed flat, the quarters stood in perfect stillness. The 12 sat in a wide ring around the fresh grave, their heads bowed, their bodies unmoving. Hours passed. Night waned. The sky lightened at the edges, but they did not rise until the sun itself climbed clear. Only then did they stand, each turning back to the duties of the day as though nothing had occurred. Not a word was spoken. No one asked. The silence itself carried the weight of what had been done. The ground above the cavity looked no different at first, but the earth had changed. The soil darkened, packed tighter than before, as if it had swallowed more than flesh. A patch formed where no cane would grow, a scar upon the fields that the wind avoided, a place the dogs skirted wide. Those who stepped too near swore they felt the air thicken, as if sound itself struggled to cross it. The earth had taken what was given, and in its own way, it remembered. That night became the 13th. The moon rose again, pale and watchful, and the silence that had built for weeks did not break. It settled instead, vast and final, like the closing of a door. The 12 returned to their cabins, to their beds of straw and thin blankets, but none of them slept. They lay still, eyes open, listening to the ground. Some said later they heard him still, faint scratching, low moans pressed through layers of earth. Others swore the sound was not his at all, but something deeper, something that had been caught and pinned. Whatever it was, it did not rise again. The overseer was gone, erased not by flight or fire but by earth and silence. No alarms were raised. No search was called. Westcott noticed only that his overseer failed to appear, but he said nothing. Perhaps he feared what the silence suggested. Perhaps he understood that some things were better left unspoken. The fields stretched on as before, cotton still gathered, bales still weighed. But within the quarters, within the soil itself, a memory had been planted that would not fade. The 13th night passed into morning, and with it came a truth that none dared voice. Justice had not come from courts or laws or overseers. It had come from the soil, from 12 pairs of hands, from silence that spoke louder than screams. And though no record would mark the deed, the land itself carried it forward, holding what had been buried, remembering with each breath of wind that brushed across the scarred patch where nothing grew. Morning came after the 13th night with skies pale and heavy, the kind of light that made everything look washed and brittle. The fields bent in the wind as they always had, the cotton still clinging to its stalks, the cane whispering in long rows. To the unknowing eye, nothing had changed. Yet within the quarters, something invisible had shifted. The 12 carried themselves differently. Their silence, once born of endurance, now held a gravity that drew others near but kept them at a distance. They no longer looked broken. They looked sealed. In the days that followed, small changes marked the air. The 12 who had buried Brant no longer spoke at all, not to each other, not to the others who lived beside them. Orders barked by drivers were met with calm eyes and quiet hands. Work was done, but no sound rose from their throats. The old songs faded. Even laughter from the children was muffled when they were near, as if the silence had spread outward and demanded respect. It was not rebellion that filled the quarters now. It was something heavier, something harder to define, a kind of waiting that had no end. One by one, the 12 began to act in ways that unsettled those around them. The cook, Sarah, was seen pressing herbs into small bundles before burning them in the fire before dawn. A stable hand drew spirals into the dirt and wiped them away before anyone else could notice. The boy Isaac traced symbols with his finger across his skin, humming a melody no one recognized. Each gesture felt deliberate, each moment heavy with purpose. They did not explain, and no one dared to ask. The silence itself was answer enough. Then death came, not with chains or bullets, but with a strange precision. Sarah was found sitting upright beside the hearth, her hands folded, her eyes still open. Isaac collapsed in the fields, lips blue, a bitter scent lingering on his breath. Another was discovered with palms pressed together, head bowed as though in prayer, though no life stirred within him. One by one they passed, each death quiet, each body marked by calmness rather than struggle. It was not despair that had claimed them. It was choice. They had chosen to follow the silence where it led. Plantation records later marked the deaths as illness, or perhaps poisoning, though the cause was written vaguely, without detail. Westcott demanded the quarters fumigated, blaming sickness carried by vermin or water. But those who lived there knew better. The 12 had given themselves to something beyond the reach of overseers, beyond the hand of any doctor. They had bound their lives to the ritual that had sealed Brant, and the end was only part of the cost. When Westcott ordered repairs to the old quarters, the men who cleared the ashes of the fire pit stumbled on what should never have been seen. Beneath the floorboards, a cavity hollowed by hands lay waiting. Its walls bore deep gouges, claw marks scratched into the timber, splinters broken and scattered. Embedded in the wood were fragments of fingernail and tufts of dark hair. Traces of copper glinted faintly, thin as wire, caught where the boards had cracked. No body remained, only proof of struggle, proof of silence stronger than screams. The workers also found the circle. 12 stones, each carved with markings unfamiliar, a blend of African lines and Christian symbols twisted into new shapes. They had been set with care, each stone angled toward the center, forming a ring that felt deliberate, like teeth closing around something no hand should release. None of the men wanted to touch them. Some swore the air above the stones pressed against their chests, making it hard to breathe. Westcott ordered the cavity filled at once, the floor sealed with pitch, the stones buried beneath layers of soil and silence. He told no one outside his household. Within a year, he fled Louisiana, dying far from the fields that had borne his name. What remained was not a story for records or ledgers. It was a story carried only in whispers, passed by those who remembered the way the 12 had walked, the way they had sat in a circle as the earth closed over the overseer. Old women told it by firelight, careful to lower their voices, careful to remind their children that justice does not always wear robes, and that silence can be sharper than steel. It was not vengeance that the 12 had sought. It was containment. The cruelty that had lived in Brant was not seen as human weakness alone. It was something darker, a hunger for pain that could not be allowed to drift unbound into death. To kill him would have released it. To bury him alive was to pin it, to fix it in place where earth could hold what flesh and rope could not. The deaths of the 12 became part of that binding. Each life given was another knot tied, another stone set firm. They had not surrendered. They had chosen to anchor what they feared most, to ensure that no one who came after would inherit the sickness that had ruled them. Their silence was not empty. It was a seal. The fields bore witness, and the scar where nothing grew marked the ground as surely as a grave. In time, the details blurred. The plantation fell into ruin, swallowed by weeds and years, and official history buried the memory under layers of omission. Yet the land did not forget. Animals skirted the patch of earth where the cavity had been filled. Children who wandered too close came back pale, unwilling to speak of what they had felt beneath their feet. The soil itself resisted, crops failing where the stones lay hidden. And in the quietest nights, when the wind held its breath and the moon rose swollen, some swore they could still hear it. A faint scratching, a breath caught beneath the ground, a voice swallowed but never gone. The 12 were gone, but their silence endured. It hung in the fields, in the broken beams, in the stories whispered from parent to child. They had given themselves not for rebellion, but for a kind of justice that no court would recognize, a justice rooted in earth and patience, and the weight of hands pressing soil over a body that refused to break. And though their names faded from memory, the seal they made remained. The land itself remembered what had been done, and it carried the silence forward. Years passed, and the plantation began to rot from within. The war swallowed Louisiana, soldiers marched across parishes, and battles broke out miles away, but the scar on Westcott's land did not fade. The big house was left to ruin, the cane fields went wild, and animals reclaimed the ditches, yet the ground above the cavity remained bare, as though scorched from underneath. Farmers who tried to plant over it found nothing but failure. Seeds would not sprout, roots would not hold, and even weeds withered as if repelled by something unseen. Children were warned never to step too close. They were told that if they did, the silence would follow them home. By the early 20th century, the plantation was remembered only in fragments. Locals spoke of a cursed patch where birds refused to land and dogs growled at nothing. Hunters skirted wide of it, swearing their rifles misfired if they lingered too long. Surveyors brought to chart the land reported compasses spinning, their tools rusting overnight, as if the metal itself recoiled from what lay below. Word spread that the ground was sick, and no buyer held the property for long. It was sold and abandoned, until deeds became little more than paper meant to pass along a burden. In 1923, a drought struck the parish, pulling moisture from the soil, cracking the earth in long, jagged lines. A boy wandering near the ruined quarters stumbled upon a strange object pushing through the dirt. It was the handle of a whip, leather cracked and curling with age, the copper tip green with rot. The boy touched it and blistered instantly, his skin bubbling as if scalded. That night he fell into a fever, whispering in a tongue no one could recognize, his eyes rolling as though chasing dreams no one else could see. His grandmother, wise with the weight of stories, took the whip and buried it beneath a stone she carved with 12 notches. She told no one where. The boy recovered, though he never spoke of what he had seen in the fever. Through the decades, stories drifted through families like smoke. Old women whispered of 12 who died so the land might stay sealed. Men spoke of nights when the earth seemed to breathe. Children dared each other to run across the barren patch, only to return pale and silent, unable to explain what pressed against their chests while they ran. Some said the scratching could still be heard if you pressed your ear to the soil, faint and steady, like fingernails clawing for escape. Others claimed that if you lingered too long in the silence, you would dream of red moons and copper singing through the air. The whip became legend, passed from mouth to mouth as a relic too dangerous to touch. Some said it had been reforged, hidden away in a church cellar, locked behind walls of stone. Others insisted it lay beneath the forest floor, wrapped in oiled cloth, waiting for hands foolish enough to dig. Wherever it was, its absence was a presence of its own. It lingered in the stories, in the unease that hung over the parish, in the way no one spoke Brant's name above a whisper. By mid-century the land had swallowed most of what it stood. The great house crumbled into its own foundations. The quarters collapsed under vines and moss. A handful of stones remained to show where walls had once risen, and a leaning chimney jutted from the weeds like a finger pointing toward the sky. Yet the scar remained, a circle of ground untouched by growth. Pilots flying overhead swore it looked different from the air, a patch of dark earth set against green fields, visible even when clouds dimmed the land. The legend of the 12 deepened as years blurred fact into fable. Some told it as justice, a rare moment when the earth itself rose to answer cruelty. Others told it as a curse, a warning of what happens when silence grows heavier than screams. Each version carried the same refrain. The overseer had not been killed, he had been claimed. The ground had swallowed him whole, and the 12 had given themselves to ensure he would never rise. Their silence became the truest language, passed forward as inheritance, not written in books, but breathed in whispers when the fire burned low. Strangers came from time to time, drawn by curiosity, by rumors carried beyond the parish lines. They brought instruments, cameras, notebooks. They left unsettled, their machines breaking down, their films spoiled, their notes disordered. Some returned once, then never again. Others vanished altogether, their names becoming another kind of silence added to the land. Those who lived nearby never asked. They already knew some places were not meant for digging. The scar endured wars, endured the turning of generations, endured the hunger of history to cover what it could not explain. It sat quiet and patient, a wound that never healed, a mouth pressed shut but never sealed. In the evenings, when the moon turned red, people stayed inside. They bolted doors and whispered prayers, hoping the silence would stay outside their walls. They never walked the fields after dark, not even with lanterns. Some truths were safer left to the soil, and the soil had grown jealous of what it held. The overseer's name faded, his cruelty blurred into shadow, but the earth remembered. The whip sang in stories long after its sound had ceased. The circle of 12 stones marked an inheritance too heavy for words, and the scarred patch whispered its own reminder. That justice had been done, not by law, not by men in robes, but by hands that chose silence and earth over screams. That silence lived on, echoing through time, a shadow in the soil that waited for the next step too near, the next ear too close, the next soul foolish enough to listen. The year was 2025, when Drive. Miriam Lane stepped onto the cracked soil of Franklin Parish. She had studied forgotten histories for years, chasing the threads of stories that official records tried to bury. Her work was not about ghosts, though people often accused her of chasing them. It was about memory, the kind that lived where words failed, where silence pressed harder than truth. When she read of Westcott Plantation in an old census, the gaps in its record caught her attention more than anything written. One line, destroyed by fire under unclear circumstances, 1863, was the kind of phrase she had learned to distrust. It was a way of hiding what could not be spoken. She followed it, and it brought her to a field where no grass grew. The plantation was gone. Only foundations swallowed by weeds remained, and a leaning chimney half-eaten by moss. The rest had been claimed by time. All that stood in shape was a single outbuilding, rotted and sagging, long mistaken for a shed. The owner of the land, an old man who refused to step foot near the site, handed her the key with shaking hands. He warned her not to go beneath the floor. His voice trembled, his eyes fixed on something she could not see. Miriam pocketed the key and walked toward the ruin anyway. Inside, the air was thick with mildew. Dust fell in lazy strands, curling into her hair as she pried open a panel in the wall with the edge of her crowbar. Behind it, she found a bundle of fabric wrapped in oilskin, brittle at the touch. A journal rested inside, the pages warped but legible. It carried no name. The writing was careful, steady, filled with accounts that blurred between confession and record. The first line chilled her blood. He screamed still. I hear him even now clawing at the earth beneath us. The entries were fragmented, some missing, others stained with something dark. Names were struck through, erased on purpose. Again and again a phrase returned, written with desperate insistence. The 13th night is when the ground remembers. Miriam copied every page she could, scanning them with care. Days later, She posted fragments on her anonymous history vlog. She did not call it fact. She called it a question. Viewers argued in the comments, some crying hoax, others claiming code, still others falling silent after a single read. Among the noise came a message from an account with no history, only a string of numbers as its name. It read, "He was never hanged. He was buried. Find the stone where the cane won't grow." She returned with ground-penetrating radar, her equipment heavy on her back. The shed creaked above her, but she paid no mind. She laid out her tools, calibrating each one, until she noticed shallow carvings on the floorboards beneath her feet. Worn with time, barely visible, they formed a circle. Her pulse quickened. She swept the radar across the soil, tracing slow lines, and on her screen a hollow emerged. Rectangular, 7 feet deep, bordered by dense material. Not rock, not entirely wood, something layered. At the center, her instruments screamed with interference. Copper residue, heavy traces of iron and hematin. She froze when the shape appeared clearly. A cylindrical object wrapped in deteriorated cloth. It could only be the whip. She photographed it, logged the coordinates, and left before dusk. That night she uploaded a private video to her channel, accessible only by password. It contained a single still, the whip half exposed in the earth, surrounded by a ring of 12 stones. Beneath the picture she typed one line. "If the 13th night breaks the seal, may no soul be near to hear him rise." Then she closed her laptop and did not post again. In the days that followed, she answered no calls. Friends tried to reach her. Colleagues grew worried, but silence wrapped around her like it had wrapped around the 12. A week later, a ranger passing through the old grounds found a collapse where the quarters had stood. The soil had sunk inward, forming a shallow pit. Along its edges were marks that looked like claw impressions, too wide for any animal. Salt lay scattered in a perfect ring around the depression, as if poured carefully by a steady hand. No prints marked the ground. No tracks led in or out. Miriam was gone. Her cottage stood empty, her belongings untouched. Months later, hikers discovered a slab of stone deep in the woods, several miles from the site. It bore no words, only a single symbol carved into its face, identical to those on the stones buried in the quarters long ago. Beneath it lay a broken lens from her camera, wrapped in oiled cloth. Nothing else remained. The parish did not speak of her. They did not need to. They had seen others come and go, each thinking themselves discoverers of truth, each swallowed by silence. The scar remained, bare and patient, untouched by rain or seed. Children still whispered of scratching beneath the soil when the wind died. Hunters still avoided the place. Farmers still shook their heads when cane refused to grow. The silence did not break. It deepened. Some nights the moon rose rust-colored, swollen with the memory of that long-ago 13th night. On those nights, the wind carried strange echoes. A scrape, a breath, a voice so faint it seemed woven into the soil itself. No court had written the story. No book had preserved it. But the earth remembered. It held the overseer who had whipped for pleasure, held the silence of the 12 who bound him, held the sacrifice that turned cruelty into warning. And still it whispered, waiting for anyone who dared to listen too closely.